for me, it's the middle of the day, and my wife is babysitting.
Thank you, Rabbi. It's very class.
Thank you. Yes.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That was an incredible start to, please God, many more classes that we have from you.
Amen. So,
thank you. We have 40 people until 10 p.m. UK time, Rob. So I think that speaks for itself. I know Rob Dweck wanted to say a few words, but on behalf of myself and Avi, thank you so much for the fantastic shiur tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. Really, the honor is mine. Baruch Hashem.
Rabbi Yonatan.
Yes.
It was the most beautiful. From what I heard, which was, I'm sorry that I didn't know the thing, but I'm going to listen to it. But the passion of your heart and your neshama and wisdom of your learning comes across so clearly. And thank goodness that we have you saying the things that you're saying and teaching the things that you're teaching, because we need you. And you're mahazik. Definitely, I'm going to sleep with Chizuk. Now, soon.
Please.
I'm very, very grateful that you've given us your time and that you've contributed to the Beit Midrash and to the learning of everyone that's been here. And I'm very grateful to you, for your strength and for your conviction. HaKadosh Baruch Hu should give you beracha, v'atzlacha, v'chol ma'aseh yadecha, v'chayr v'chayr, yafitzu kol ma'anotecha chutza. And Yehi Ratzon, that you should be mezakeh rabim, should be zochet talmidim rabim shiratam kodemet lechachmatam. And thank you very much for all that you're doing, and we look forward to hearing more from you.
Amen. Rabbi Dweck, you should be blessed. And again, if I could just say, thank you for having me, and really what you do sets a model for not just Sephardic leadership, but rabbinic leadership in the whole world, and it's an honor to be able to sit here beside you. And if I may say one last thing, and that is, it's only because of rabbis like you that I'm able to say the things that I say, to know that I have friends in the world, and I know that we've only communicated via letters until today. So Sina, as much as you tried to get us face to face, we finally did it today at the end of the shiur. But Baruch Hashem, it's because of friends like you in the world that we can really do what we do. And I hope to be half the source of chizuk as you've been to me. Thank you. Amen. Thank you, Kol Tov.
Thank you so much, Rob. Thank you. Great to see you all. And next week we're back Tuesday with Rob Dweck, continuing the Sephardi Teshuvot series. So remember, next week is Tuesday, not Wednesday, same time. If you're in the WhatsApp group, you'll get all the information. Good night, good day, wherever you are. Thank you all so much. Rabbi Halevy, thank you.
Laila Tov. Have a good night. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to stick around. If not, I'll send you all off to bed. B'ezrat Hashem.
Rabbi Yonatan,
yes. Sure, David, how are you?
Very, very interesting. Everything, history. Is there a contradiction by saying that on the one hand the Shulchan Aruch is this unifying halacha that we should all on the one hand saying that we need to go back and hark back to the Shulchan Aruch, and on the other hand that we were looking for a single halacha that unifies the whole Jewish people. In that, on one side you're telling us to hold strong to what we have, but on the other side you're saying we want to look for a unifying mechanism. Surely by incorporating, say, the other chumrot of our neighbors, that way we'll have a more uniform community.
That's actually a really good question, David. I appreciate that question. I think that the answer to that question is just to look around at those neighbors that we're talking about. So let's talk about this, and without using ethnic terms, those who.
Can I
yeah.
Just, I mean, within, for example, let's say normative.
Yes.
Halachic opinions.
Of course. And by the way, there were Sephardi communities like in Baghdad, which did follow the rulings of the Rama almost always. That is a unique thing that did exist there, and that was motivated by something similar. But I think if you look around the Jewish community today, you'll see. I can tell you that for me, halakha stops with Maran. I can tell you that quite confidently. I know that those who are Yemenites, for example, will tell you almost quite confidently, halakha stops with the Rambam. And the Jews who don't follow Maran per se, where does the line stop for them? Which community has one line that they stop at? Where does it end? Where is the Rama the final word? Because I know that when I rule for Ashkenazim according to the Rama, with the Mishnah Berurah, the Chayei Adam, the rabbi that's living next door to me, meaning there's never any end to who we do follow. So the reason to go back to Maran is simply that this is the last time that one singular code of law was accepted across the continents. it's not that could there be unity? Yes, there could be unity by incorporating other opinions, but who's to say what we'll incorporate, what we won't, and when anybody will be happy? Even the Rama accepts the authority of Maran. So, and that's for another shiur, but according to the Rama, he would be happy if we ruled like Maran. And so for me, this is the last place we can go to where it's similar, I'm not comparing, but it's similar to what the Rambam writes in his introduction to the Mishneh Torah. The Rambam is asked, he writes about the Talmud and how the reason why the Talmud is the final book that unites the Jewish people. Every Gaon can write whatever he wants afterwards, but you can't compel the people of one country to follow the Gaon of a different country. You can only compel the Jewish people to follow the Talmud. The reason being, among other things, and I'm aware of the conversations surrounding national courts and Bedin Hagadol, I'm not sticking my head there right now, but the general idea of this is the last book that all the Jewish people accepted upon themselves. And so if we can bring people back to this place, we can compel them to go back to this place. And so I'm not saying not to hold on to what you have, per se. There is a contradiction, perhaps slightly. But in terms of unity, what other book would you recommend? So if we throw out a book, which book could you recommend that we would all be able to get behind? All of us.
It's a good question.
The answer is the Shulchan Aruch. That's the answer. The Mishneh Torah, is that Yoshua you spoke?
Yes.
Yeah, so by the way, someone asked me a good question. It was even maybe Zev Godkin, I see him here. Maran tried to unite the Sephardim and Ashkenazim, but the Ashkenazim didn't get on board. So if that's the case, why give in to Maran? Just go back to the Rambam. I would love to say that the Rambam is the central code, but I don't know of any one work of Ashkenazi halakha written on the Rambam. Meaning, for us, the Rambam may be the giant of the world, but for the Ashkenazim, they categorically rejected the Rambam. For them, the Rambam is a curiosity. It's almost like the way you and I would view Rashi on the Chumash, that sense of authority. I'm not happy to say that. It just is what it is.
But the Ashkenazim also rejected the Shulchan Aruch.
They did not reject the Shulchan Aruch. No, you're right.
They did not accept it. For sure, they did not accept it. And also the fact, like you mentioned, that Rabbi Yosef kind of uses the three pillars of halakha. What do we do in cases in which he doesn't? Because there's many cases in which he doesn't follow anyone. So does his ruling override the Rambam, the Rosh and the Rif altogether?
Yoshua, that's a very good question. So I'm going to be giving a follow-up class about that. Though today was about we accept Kabbalat Horot Maran, and then except for when we don't. There's hundreds of cases you're going to show me where we don't accept the rulings of Maran, and almost nobody accepts the rulings. Or cases where Maran doesn't follow his own, like you just mentioned now, a good example. Maran doesn't follow his own process that he said he was going to follow. We're going to discuss all of those things. I'm not here to tell you that Maran's Shulchan Aruch is perfect. That's not my intent. When it comes to preferences, that's when I'm talking now about halakha. Ashkenazim accept almost everything Maran writes, except for the few places where the Rama disagrees. And that's the truth. You cannot say the same thing about the Rambam. The Ashkenazim don't have one running commentary in the Rambam that they would study the Rambam and then know what Ashkenazim do a little bit differently. The way that Maran was treated in Ashkenaz is completely different than the way the Rambam was treated in Ashkenaz. For the better or for the worse. I don't know why history works out that way, but in terms of a place where we can go to one book and say here, even if you wanted to come to a place, this is what I do in my community. Maran for the Sephardim, Rama for the Ashkenazim, I can find all that in one place. All of that is accessible in one book. It doesn't require anything else. The fact that Chachamei Ashkenaz never wrote works like the Rama on the Rambam tells you something about it.
But isn't the fact of saying that like we've all accepted it, like don't we need a Sanhedrin really establish Sanhedrin for it to be really accepted? Because clearly, if there were 200 Rabbanim that supported what Maran said, but there were clearly many other Rabbanim which we didn't mention that didn't support him, because otherwise we would have had a Sanhedrin and it would have been accepted.
Yoshua, these are all good questions. I'm going to address these questions. The question here of what about all those who didn't accept Maran? Baruch Hashem, in the beginning of the shiur, I already told you, there are many people who didn't accept Maran. When I'm talking here, and you're correct in pointing out one thing, Maran Shulchan Aruch doesn't have the status of a Bedin Hagadol in Yerushalayim. That's not the case. That wouldn't be accurate to say such a thing. Rather, we're talking about what was actually done. As much as we might like to have this conversation, and I know I'm familiar with all of the groups of people. Why the Shulchan Aruch? We have a Mishneh Torah. Show me the Sephardi community in the world, all the Chachamim that we know of in the Sephardic world. Put the Yemenites aside for just a moment. I'm half Yemenite. Put that on the side. Which Sephardic community rejected the Shulchan Aruch that you know of, that was around anywhere? There wasn't one.
I don't want to.
Every Bet Adin in every country that we had ever followed Maran. It's a fact. It's not a discussion about that. We can argue why they did that. I'm happy to have the conversation. I'm telling you what was the reality. In Syria, in Morocco, in Iraq, in Algeria, in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Lebanon, everywhere. They all ruled according to Maran. So yeah, we might have a love for the Rambam, but the Rambam didn't become the final word even in the Sephardic communities. We may not like that. I might not like that. I'm not telling you that I'm a fan of the fact that the Rambam was rejected for the Rosh. Please, if anybody is going to champion the Rambam over the Rosh, it's going to be me. But in terms of facts, the fact is what I just said is accurate.
But I think that in itself reflects diversity and beauty of the Torah.
How so?
If everyone followed the Rambam, it'd be pretty boring for all of us. And I don't think that's a true reflection of what the Talmud itself represents. The idea that you have the Tanaim and the Amoraim, and all the different mahloket that's between them. I think if everyone held like the Rambam, I don't know, you could argue that perhaps that's why we've ended up where we have, because there is diversity and there is the idea of having diverse opinions, and different places do different things. The Rambam many times quotes the minhag of where he was, a few times, not many times. He does. Did he mean that what the minhag was in the part of Spain that he was would apply to everywhere else? Perhaps not. Maybe that wasn't his intention. This purist idea that what the Rambam said has to be halakha now, I don't know, the reality it's not the case, and there's a reason for that.
Rabbi Elisha, you just walked into Sina's group and said pretty much, if we all followed the Rambam, it would be boring. And if you weren't his older brother, I would say that I'm not brave enough to ever say such a sentence in front of Sina. So you have some kind of seniority over here.
I would say I completely see where my brother's coming from.
Oh.
This is no purist Rambamist cult.
But let's say, Rabbi Elisha, if we could appreciate for just a moment that the clearest and most decisive legal code that we have is the Rambam's Mishneh Torah. In terms of clarity, in terms of also Talmudic conclusions, if we're going to line up one by one what the Talmud actually concludes, the superiority of the Mishneh Torah speaks for itself. And I'm not going to, there's no way that I can make an argument against it. But what you're saying, yes, clearly the thousands of Chachamim who've expressed opinions other than what the Rambam said shows you that at any point in time the conversation was a lot more colorful than we would like to believe. But that follows with Maran too. Even those who adhered to Maran, which some of you mentioned already, didn't always follow Maran. Because at the end of the day, you don't turn off your own brain, you don't turn off your own logic, and you don't turn off your own analysis because of the acceptance of a book. Maybe if I could compare it, something similar, if I could. I'm not saying that it's a hard comparison, like accurate completely to the point. But in any country in the world, you have a legal system, there are laws. But at the end of the day, there's a certain amount of leeway that a judge has as to when to enforce a law, when not to enforce a law, when to decide that something should be treated more severely than it actually is a crime, or less severely than it is. I think that accepting the law, the legal code that we have, doesn't take away from a chacham the ability to guide people in the direction that certain place or community needs. There's a unique teaching among many Sephardi Chachamim that we are never stricter than Maran except for one area. When it comes to issues of immorality, tzniut between people, things like that, that's something that every Chacham knows the place and the circumstances that are going to be born there, and has to be very careful, even to do more than what Maran would have told you to do, to make sure that we can uphold our community's integrity. I think that this feeling of if we follow one code, then we get turned off, our brains get turned off, our thoughts get turned off. It is the opposition to the codes. That's where the opposition does voice that opinion. But I don't think that that's accurate. Just because that's true, just because there's a foundation, doesn't mean that nobody has the right to build on that foundation. And I think that the Chachamim of our generation did both. They accepted the foundation, and then they continued to legislate on top of that foundation. Albeit with less authority than the Talmud. So what? Many things have happened to us after the Talmud. It's been a long time.
Actually, if I could chime in a little bit over here to
Sure.
agree with and add on to the previous comment, and perhaps slightly reinterpret it, in other words, that if you're going to take all of Judaism, all of Torah, this giant, massive and funnel it down into the mind of a single man who, for all his greatness, is a man of flesh and blood, and what's the word? Bottleneck everything into that narrow, funnel. Just like in biology, an intellectual bottleneck is not healthy. So, speaking of Sephardi Habura, Abarbanel talks a lot about the locus of halachic authority and legal authority. For example, in Parashat Shoftim, he says that, he talks about the Sanhedrin and what he thinks it was like back in the day. And he says you have to remember that there were always 12 tribes, and that they were always kind of sort of semi-independent of one another, but bound together in a multi-tiered system where there was local judges appointed by the people in each, village or whatever, small local area. And then on top of that, there was another layer, for each tribe. And on top of that, there was the layer of the Sanhedrin. Almost like in countries we have today, where there's the local judge, and there's the state judge, and there's the federal judge. There were layers of authority so that no one body had all this power concentrated into it.
Except
and it didn't create this bottleneck where you had so few minds having a say. And just bringing that into the subject you talked about at the beginning about this reinstitution of the Sanhedrin, although I can absolutely see the benefit of having that unification of the Jewish people who've been far-flung to all parts of the globe, I can also see how people could get pretty offended by that, because not everyone was invited to the party. And in contrast to that, back in the day of the 12 tribes, they were all kind of in more or less one area, and everyone had the opportunity to have representation and to give their point of view. Whereas if you're convening a group of your own clique in one location and then expecting everybody else to join in and you kind of fall in line to one degree or another, let's say I'd be more surprised that people would want to join that than would not, given politics and stuff the way it is.
Okay, so I agree. Let me throw out two things here. One is just the first thing one of the things you mentioned was about the multi-layered system of courts. The Rambam explicitly mentions all that also in his Mishnah Torah regarding the different local courts and the different areas and how it finally reaches. But there's one thing that I don't think is correct, and that is there is a Supreme Court that overrides anybody else and anything else. There is a Bedin Hagadol that sits in Jerusalem, and there is, you call it a bottleneck or not, it's built up of enough Chachamim that represent enough of the various segments of the population that we didn't view it as what this word of intellectual bottleneck. It didn't boil down to one man, but it boiled down to one body, most definitely. And in every civilized country, you have the same thing. That there's a Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is trusted to make such decisions. I think the second thing is that when we talk about someone like the Rambam being one person, or even Maran being one person, and then you're taking one person for being the epitome of all the Torah that came before him, I think that's where things like Matayim Rabbanim Nismach, when you write an article as a scientist and you publish it into a peer-reviewed journal, a real one, not the fake ones flying around, a real famous one with a reputation, and you have peers that critique and they argue or they agree with something, so the fact that you write something that 200 of your peers agree with should tell you something about the truth or the authenticity of what it is that you're writing. So for us, it wasn't just that Maran wrote a book and expected us to follow it. It's the fact that 200 other, and the number is not necessary, so tell me it's 50 other. But the other Chachamim that led our countries, at least where we were in, all saw that work, studied that work, and agreed to what was written in that work. Obviously, maybe an exception here, an exception there, like any peer-reviewed journal would be. That tells you something, that it's not just one person who wrote his idea or his approach or his philosophy. The same thing with the Rambam. From all the people who disagreed with him and tried to make notes on him or whatever else, if I'm thinking of the Ravad, for example. The Ravad often makes a note and says, oh, look, there's a different opinion the Rambam's not telling you about. But look at the thousands of Chachamim that prove that the Rambam's attitude is not just that it's not his opinion, but that's what the Talmud actually meant. But the fact that they agreed and they accepted it means that it's not that they all are following one person. You're talking about independent Chachamim, Avod Batei Din in different countries, in different communities, of different persuasions that all accept Maran, and it's not just because he was one special person, but because they accept the things that he wrote inside of his book. I think that speaks volumes for Maran and the Rambam, and I think that's why we normally don't treat such big books like that. I'm not talking about smaller books. Such main fundamental works, we don't treat them as one man's opinion. A man, yes. An opinion, not necessarily. The fact that so many other Chachamim agreed, it's not that they followed, they agreed with the things written there, tells you what they thought about that book and the integrity of that book. But I think it's a good point. David, I see you saying something. David, I'm talking to you.
Hi. Isn't that though a temporary solution because we're in Galut? So Chachamim have agreed to follow Maran, across the board, because we don't have a Sanhedrin. So therefore, it's a limited, like what was previously said. It's a limited system that's put in place, as bediavad, basically, until we can get that Supreme Court diversity that really does represent us all.
I think you're right. That's absolutely right. Not just a little bit right. That's the complete truth. And I believe that Maran was writing his book for the Golim. I mean, he was dealing with the exile. That's why Maran doesn't codify anything that has to do with redemption or future governments. Or Maran knows that his era will end, and he's surely intent that that's what will happen. And that's why I did mention how Abuziel. Now, that's why I once mentioned this. Abuziel, people got mad at me. I don't care. I have a shiur with Jewish Stockholm syndrome. I recommend if I can recommend myself. But this piece, Rabbi Uziel really believed that now that we're back in Israel in one place, and he was talking about the founding of the state of Israel. So things have definitely changed. We've again become entrenched in different ideologies and groups. He felt that it was really possible to gather together Shivim Zekenim, 70 elders, Chachamim, that represent all the different parts of Am Yisrael that you could find, sit around the table and start with A and go through Z and say, Shechita. Let's argue about the Talmud. What do we agree on is going to be not a standard of shechita as in what's politically correct, but what do we believe is legally correct? And they would make such decisions for the whole Jewish people, and then you wouldn't have to worry because it's not Ashkenazim giving it to Sephardim, it's not Sephardim giving it to Ashkenazim, it's not Yemenites giving it to Shulchan Aruch. It's we, my Chacham and your Chacham and his Chacham and her Chacham, they all got together. And they agreed on these things that we've agreed to accept, and that would be a model of a Bedin Hagadol sitting in Jerusalem. The answer to Rabbi Uziel's request, though, was met with crickets chirping. Nobody came. Nobody wanted. Nobody was interested. And I think that's part of this. We as Am Yisrael much rather this fragmented, compartmentalized Judaism than something national and grand and glorious. I will say, because Pam taught me now to look at the other side of the equation. What do other people feel? Imagine this. Imagine if we had some kind of Bedin Hagadol in Jerusalem that we didn't feel represented us. Kind of like every rabbi I know that is in Jerusalem. And then they put out some proclamation, and now we're in a position where we're bullied. Because who's going to make it to the top of a renewed Sanhedrin? A reconvened Sanhedrin, and now in 2020, is going to be whichever Rebbe has the most bodyguards or whoever has the most money. Or this works. The Jewish community works like that today. So who's going to make it to the top? The people who can bully themselves to the top. In which case, we're going to be victims of a system that bullies us into obedience. And so I think that yes, the goal is to have a Bedin Hagadol. I know that some Chachamim tried. Rabbi Yehuda Maimon tried to put together a Sanhedrin. Rabbi Steinsaltz, who just passed away, tried to put together a Sanhedrin. For whatever reason, Am Yisrael is not biting. They don't want it. They're afraid of unity, and they like to preach about unity. They all talk about unity. Teach about unity. The same rabbi who told you about unity that spends the rest of the year trashing everybody else in the world, and that's the same style. But you're right. Shulchan Aruch is a band-aid that is meant to get us from our last redemption to the next one. And I think that sadly, if what Chacham Fa'ur says about exile is true, then we most definitely are still in that exile and are skukim. If you want to make an argument should be the Mishneh Torah, I'm with you, Mishneh Torah. Whatever it's going to be, we just have to get Am Yisrael to agree to something. That's the bottom, and I think that was the motivation for so many Chachamim accepting Maran. It wasn't an act of subservience or submission to some great man from Israel. It was they all saw this need to unite and rally together around something. you're right, at least till they get to the same place and can reconvene and do this all together. But we haven't even managed to do that. We haven't even managed to get Am Yisrael to be happy with the Shulchan Aruch. So that's where we're at right now. It's a sad state of the union. Anyone else before we head out for the night? Okay, I'm wishing everybody a Laila Tov, a good evening. Thank you so much for learning with me. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate it. I want to. Someone say something? Oh, thank you, Avi. Thank you so much for having me. Oh, Hashem.
I'm sure we will have lots of questions, but I think a lot of them will be covered by this, the following shirim about, the exceptions, and that's why I don't really want to ask too much, because I know that it's getting late for all of us, and also I think we will cover them. But thank you, Rav. It's really inspiring, and
thank you for hosting me. Laila Tov. I wish everybody a good night. Thank you so much for having me here tonight. That's my son Al-Hanan and my wife Rabbi Devora. Thank you for doing what you do to make this happen. Oh, Hashem.
Absolutely. We're so proud. Hi, Papa.
Hi.